I'm very, very glad to be able to make this presentation to you today via this videotape, and I wish to thank the various people here at Nottoway from the Film and Media Group who made this possible. And I hope I'll be able to be there in person soon. The topic of the presentation is the correlation between the ideas of men and nature and the success or failure of building civilizations, with a focus on China, which is the general theme of the conference. In general, it's well known that the oligarchical institutions attempt to justify their genocidal policies by blaming starvation, wars, disease, and so forth on overpopulation. This is a common policy. And in that, they maintain a very special place for China and India, primarily because that constitutes about 2/5 of the world's population. They argue that it is impossible for China and other nations of that sort to develop unless they drastically reduce their populations. In fact, they go beyond that and argue that these nations must not develop precisely because of the size of their populations. In the recent pop bestseller, Preparing for the 21st Century, written by Yale guru Paul Kennedy, he argues that China and India must be kept in a state of low energy use and primitive existence. He says, quote, "Development would bring appalling consequences for their environment and would threaten the Earth's overall atmosphere. China's industrial ambitions," he says, "pose a threat to the planet." Development is a threat to the planet, according to this fellow. And such evil is unfortunately not new in this century. It's been the policy of those like Arnold Toynbee and Bertrand Russell and others throughout the 20th century. But we must look at China the way that Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz did, together with his Jesuit associates that he was in correspondence with, who were missionaries in China back in the late 17th and early 18th century. These Jesuits who, beginning with the extraordinary Matteo Ricci, who reached China in the late 16th century, came armed with the fruits of the Golden Renaissance, with maps, astronomical instruments, musical instruments, paintings that used the Renaissance perspective that had been developed in Florence, and so forth. And what they found in China was not a primitive, backwards culture, but an extremely advanced culture, one which was already not only developed in science and technology, but in many areas were far in advance of European culture, and certainly pre-Renaissance culture in various areas of science and technology. And in fact, also was an extremely learned population that was very much open to the new ideas that were coming out of the Golden Renaissance. They also found 160 million people. And this was, at that time, about 1/4 of the world's population, with a density of about 40 people per square kilometer, which was nearly twice that of Europe at the time. They had a generally higher, or at least equivalent standard of living, and a generally higher rate of literacy. Now, to Leibniz, this proved something. It proved that this society had mastered, to a significant degree, the fundamental laws of nature. That it was proof, basically, that they knew God, in the sense that, to the degree that they were able to sustain the continuing, unfolding creation. And Leibniz studied the Confucian classics with exactly this in mind. He was studying the translations that had been provided to him by the Jesuits, and he approached it based on the assumption that the fundamental understanding of man as having been created in the image of God, imago viva Dei, must be embedded in their philosophical writings, as proven by their advanced culture and by their high population. Now, the purpose of this was not to gratuitously gloss over shortcomings and errors within Confucian philosophy. It was not to propitiate the Chinese, which is what the Jesuits are virtually always accused of, to attempt to win favor with the Chinese by accepting their ideas. This was not the point. The point was to scientifically discover the cause in the ideas of the development of Chinese civilization, which they discovered, what they found there. And the only place you could look for such a cause is precisely in the coherence of their ideas with the fundamental laws of the universe, the scientific laws of the universe. The problem in China today is not overpopulation. It's that this nation has been subjected to 150 years of British opium, British imperial looting, foreign wars, civil wars, and then 44 years of Maoist lunacy. And the result of this, over the long term, is the general breakdown of the infrastructure in that nation, both the physical infrastructure and the human infrastructure, especially in regard to education. And as a result, this renders the existing economy generally incapable of sustaining this very large population. Now, the IMF and Deng Xiaoping's reformers plan to solve this problem through a process of mass forced abortion and through a process of generally grinding up what they call the surplus labor, the blind flow of labor, the now almost 200 million unemployed Chinese peasants who are being ground up in free trade zones for cheap labor. We're looking at a potential for another Holocaust in China, caused by precisely the same forces who have caused repeated Holocausts throughout Chinese history. Now, please turn to slide 1, and if I can ask you to gear in on this. I'll just point at this one. I'd like you to come in on it. This is a chart, which you'll be able to see there at the conference, and I'll show on tape, of the population between about 400 BC in China through about 1950. You can't see the numbers very well here. I hope you can better at the conference. But this starts at 400 BC, and then you can see the general shape of this. And you can see that it's a very volatile chart as well. And at the conference, you should have above that a chart of world population. And I want you to note that that world chart is not on the same scale. So it's going to be, don't try to judge point for point, but rather I want you to see the different shapes of these curves. Okay. Now, let me see. I guess I should ask you to come back onto me here. Yeah. Come back. I think what I'm going to do is lift this up when I get to it. That might be easier. Okay, now, to reverse this process of collapse, we must first ask what caused this population to grow in the first place. And to do that, we have to look at Confucius. Now, Confucius died in 479 BC. What he did during his lifetime, among other things, is that he compiled what are called the 5 classics, which they're a compilation of the oral and written tradition of Chinese antiquity, together with his own contributions. To Confucius, the Golden Age, which he writes about, was actually far before his own time. It spans an era from approximately 2500 BC through about 1000 BC. And in fact, there can be no doubt about the existence of advanced civilizations, despite various people who attempt to say that this is a mythical age or that Confucius made this up for his own purposes. But there's no doubt about the existence of these advanced civilizations because the evidence for this, astronomical evidence, exists within the classics themselves. 19th century European scholars and astronomers, whom we are now looking into today, used passages from these 5 classics, in particular from the Book of History, or the History Classic, which specify, in one case, the meridian passages of a series of stars at the summer solstice. And using the precession of the equinox, it's possible now to prove that these measurements must have taken place precisely in the year 2357 BC, which locates a culture at that time with an extremely advanced capacity to carry out scientific investigation of the heavens. Another reference to a specific constellation has been almost certainly traced back to the 16th millennium, 16,000 years before Christ, which indicates it gives you a sense of the scope of Chinese historical and scientific research. And in fact, it can be shown that every culture up until that time, every ruling group, had based their authority upon their astronomical studies and their development of solar calendars. Now, LaRouche has emphasized repeatedly that the beginning of the recognition of man as being in the image of God in early civilizations can be and must be traced to the study of the lawfulness of the circular action within the heavens. What I'd like to do is to show you a couple of examples from Confucius classics. And if you put up slide 2, you don't have to do anything, but at the conference, please put up slide 2. In the Analects, which is the collection of Confucius' own teachings, the master is asked by some of his disciples, what will we do when you die? Where will we turn for guidance when you die? And his response to that is, look to the heavens. What do they say? Do the seasons not run their appointed course, and all things proceed according to their nature? Look to the heavens. What do they say? Put up slide 3. In the poetry classic, or the Book of Poetry, the following poem is contained, which is quoted both by Confucius and by Mencius, which is on the intelligibility of the creation and on the source of human virtue being located in the quest for mastering that lawfulness. Heaven, in creating mankind, created all things according to law, such that people can grasp this law and will love virtue. Now, Confucius identified a concept which is called in Chinese zhen, which is spelled J-E-N generally, which is the fundamental principle of God's creation and of man's essence as he reflects that creation. Zhen is often translated as love or benevolence or humaneness in English. And throughout Chinese history, there's been the same kind of debate around what the real meaning of zhen is along those same lines. It's clear, however, that both Confucius and Mencius meant by this term an attempt to capture the same idea that St. Paul was trying to capture when he developed the idea of agape, meaning the higher love, God's divine love for his creation, which is the higher form of human love, which is achieved when the emotions and the intellect are joined, representing the love of truth and the love of beauty and the love of all mankind. This is the basic sense in which the word zhen was used by Confucius. And this is, if you look at that poem I just had on, this is the love of virtue, which is seen in that poem on the slide, which derives, if you look at the poem, it derives from accepting God's love through grasping his laws, through the study of the lawfulness of the universe, which is the way in which you express virtue or love. Now, Mencius extended this concept to assert, Mencius was about 200 years after Confucius and was the greatest follower of Confucius. He extended this concept to assert that man is born fundamentally good, in precisely the way that Plato asserted that man is born fundamentally good. He argued that zhen and the other fundamental virtues, which were righteousness, propriety, and wisdom, all of which were subsumed under this concept of zhen, he argued that these were not imposed on man from the outside, but that they're born within him, and that all men are born equal in precisely this respect, that they have the same potential for good to participate in the ongoing creation. Now, that men may differ from one another, he says, in respect to these virtues, but that's simply due to their failure to carry out their potential, which is born in them. To both Confucius and Mencius, the primary responsibility of those who properly develop their inborn powers, what they call the inborn luminous virtue, is to apply those powers to the development of the nation, what we would think of today as physical and political economy. Even the emperor, although the emperor was known as the son of heaven, the emperor under the Confucian worldview was not above this natural law, that he was responsible for the development of his nation. In the very famous passage from the end of the Analects, Confucius quotes Emperor Yao from the Golden Age, who is near his death and says to his successor, Emperor Shun, quote, "The God-ordained order of succession now rests upon thy person. Hold fast with thy heart and soul to the true middle course of the right. If there should be distress and want among the people within the empire, then the mandate of heaven shall be taken away from you forever." So this mandate is dependent upon his carrying out the benefit and the livelihood of his nation. So, this is the historical process. If you can go back to slide 1, please, and keep that up. This is the historical process that gave rise to a population of over 25 million people by the time of Confucius, which then, between the time of Confucius over the next 400 years, doubled. There are obvious parallels with Christian teaching within Confucian teaching. In fact, one of the most fundamental tenets of Confucianism is the Golden Rule, to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Nicholas of Cusa, whose work generated the Golden Renaissance in the 15th century, and about whom we'll discuss a great deal today, in his essay on the Peace of the Faith, makes reference to this Golden Rule and to the commandment to love God when he says the following, quote, "The divine commandments are very brief and are all well known and common in every nation, for the light that reveals them to us is created along with the rational mind." And in the same way, Leibniz, who was in his study of Confucianism, and especially the Confucian Renaissance masters of the 11th and 12th century, whom I'll discuss later, said this about their teachings. This is what he said about Confucianism. To offend heaven is to act against reason. To ask pardon of heaven is to reform oneself and to make a sincere return in work and deed in the submission one owes to this very law of reason. For me, says Leibniz, I find this all quite excellent and quite in accord with natural theology. Only by strained interpretation and interpolation could one find anything to criticize in this point. It is pure Christianity, insofar as it renews the natural law inscribed on our hearts, except for what revelation and grace add to it to improve our nature. Now, it's this notion that this is natural law, which is contained within Confucianism as it is within Christianity, which is the fundamental point. I want to add that Mencius takes this idea of the mandate of heaven and extends it beyond the emperor to apply to anyone in any kind of a position of political responsibility. He says that there's absolutely no difference between killing a man with a sword and killing him with the style of government. And in a passage which has an eerie familiarity to today's world and to today's moral collapse and to the general corruption in the judicial system, which I see here every day, Mencius says the following, quote, "They are only men of education who without a dependable livelihood are still able to maintain a fixed heart. As to the people, if they have not a dependable livelihood, it follows that they will not have a fixed heart. And if they have not a fixed heart, there is nothing which they will not do in the way of self-abandonment, moral deflection, of depravity, and of wild license. When they have thus been involved in crime, to then follow them up and to punish them, this is to entrap the people. How can such a thing as entrapping the people be done under the rule of a benevolent man?" So you can see that the position of leadership, the position of the prince at that time, is not a privilege. It's a heavy responsibility to heaven. You're called upon to lead through the example of one's own virtue and not through arbitrary power. Now, I want to mention two contemporary views on the comparison between Confucianism and the Judeo-Christian theology, both of which I think are quite insightful. The first one is that of Bishop Chung, who is the retired bishop of Taiwan, of Taipei actually, who recently met with Leni Rubinstein when she was in Taiwan and presented her with a recent translation of a book that he wrote in the 1970s. Bishop Chung is writing for his parishioners, and he tells the Chinese not to feel slighted that God did not choose the Chinese race for the incarnation of his son. After all, he said, if the son is going to be born, he's going to have to be born into some family, and in any case, it's for all mankind, so it doesn't really matter what race he chose. And in any case, God had to prepare whatever race he was going to choose for the coming of this event. And that's why he revealed himself to Abraham and to Moses and so forth and created the Jewish religion, which allowed hundreds and hundreds of years of the knowledge of one God amongst the Jews in order to prepare the way. Now, Bishop Chung says that the Jewish knowledge of God was based primarily on the law, Mosaic law, the Ten Commandments, which instilled the fear of God in man. But, said the bishop, it lacked the sense of the all-pervasive love, which was the message of Christ, to love one another and even to love one's enemies. But lo, says Bishop Chung, this Christian love is really the same as Zhen to Confucius. So we Chinese should be very proud that God revealed this beautiful truth to us 500 years before he did in the West. Although he goes on to point out that the Confucian understanding of agape or of Zhen was not quite the same as Christ, precisely because the Confucian idea of justice demanded that in return for an act of injustice, one must return justice. But it didn't go so far as to recognize that one must return love and kindness. Now, the second reference, which I think is comments on this, is the work of Professor William Theodore de Berry from Columbia. He's one of the few decent scholars that I found amongst the massive Confucius revival that has taken place since the death of Mao Zedong. Professor de Berry points to the Hebrew covenant with God, which he says has no parallel in Confucianism. I would say it has a certain parallel with this mandate of heaven. But the difference is that the mandate of heaven is meant for the emperor, for the leadership. And as Professor de Berry points out, the covenant was meant for all Jews. That the covenant was not a privilege which gave Jews a freedom to do what they will because they were the chosen race. but rather it was a heavy responsibility which was placed upon each and every Jew to follow God. And it's this personal accountability for all people which is, says Professor DeBerry, lacking in Confucianism. The ruler, the minister, the sage, they're given a heavy responsibility, a heavy burden, and it's uncompromising. But such responsibility is seldom placed on the common people. In fact, if there are problems amongst the population, it's the leaders who are blamed. There is generally a lack of someone like Lynn, or a good Baptist minister, as we've all become familiar, who is both fearless before corrupt officials, but at the same time places the full weight of responsibility on the common man, who tolerates this corruption in the leadership in order to protect his own personal corruptions, his own personal inaction. And this is not a small point. The lack of a personal responsibility for the world as a whole leads to a policy of pragmatism. And with a pragmatist point of view, where truth becomes secondary to convenience or to immediate gain, then creative activity becomes virtually impossible. One cannot be creative if truth is not the goal, if in fact you're looking for a pragmatic end rather than for the truth itself. And one therefore either slowly or more rapidly is going to descend to the level of the beast. Confucius was very much aware of this problem of pragmatism, and in the very first chapter of the Analects, Confucius is called to a prince who asks him, "What can you teach me that will be of profit to my reign?" And rather than giving him some answer, he completely denounces him and says that why are you asking for what will profit you in the short term instead of what is true? And this is recurrent, such things are throughout the Confucius and Mencius writings. Zhu Xi, whom I'll talk about later, Zhu Xi was the leader of the Confucian Renaissance in the 12th century, recognized this problem, and he recognized the source of this problem, and essentially he solved it. And this is something which we have to make sure is maintained today. What he did was that he extended the concept of the mandate of heaven to all citizens, such that he was thus insisting that each of us must, in fact, answer to God for the state of our society as a whole, whether or not we're elected officials. And in this sense, it's placing that awesome responsibility upon each and every person because of their freedom, so that you have this freedom but this necessity. Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who was the founder of the Chinese Republic, who led the revolution in 1911, and was unquestionably one of the great leaders worldwide of the 20th century, focused precisely on this problem of pragmatism as the most profound problem amongst the Chinese people throughout history. His book on the psychology of the Chinese, which was known as, in the West, it was known as the Autobiography of a Revolutionary, identifies the ancient Chinese adage that, quote, knowledge is easy, action is difficult. And Dr. Sun Yat-sen said that this is the root of virtually every crisis throughout Chinese history. He insisted the exact opposite is the case, is that it's knowledge that is difficult and is primary, and that when knowledge is complete, then action will be self-evident. And he recognized this as a problem of pragmatism. John Dewey, the founder of modern pragmatism, when he traveled to China at the beginning of this century, along with Bertrand Russell, latched onto this pragmatism as a lever in his project to undermine and destroy Confucianism. And it's a problem which still plagues China today. It's true amongst the Chinese democracy movement, with the people that we run into around the world, and also amongst the scientists and officials within the Chinese government today, both in Taiwan and in the mainland. Now, before I discuss Zhu Xi and the Confucian Renaissance, I want to look at the other side. The opposition to Confucianism took two forms. And the second of these was a tyrannical political movement called legalism, which I'll discuss in a moment. But the first was the sponsorship of the mystical gobbledygook, which is called Taoism. The founder of Taoism is Lao Tzu. And Lao Tzu was a contemporary of Confucius. He insisted that since knowledge of the infinite, of the true path, or the Tao, is impossible, and what we do is basically meaningless in regard to the ultimate course of the Tao anyway, and therefore, he said, we will be in true tune with the Tao if we do absolutely nothing. Here's what Lao Tzu says, quote, do nothing and all things will be done. I do nothing and my people become good of their own accord. Abandon wisdom and discard knowledge, and the people will be benefited 100-fold. So as you can see, Adam Smith was a Taoist, and the invisible hand was a Taoist plot. Maggie Thatcher unquestionably was a Maoist priestess. Not surprisingly, the British have recently launched a virtual Taoist revival in their press. The Guardian last month ran an article by a prominent philosophy professor with the extremely unfortunate name of Ray Billington, who argues that the world has now proved itself to be Hobbesian. That you can see in Bosnia, elsewhere in Africa, Asia, around the world, you can see that people have basically abandoned themselves to greed and lust. Everybody has gone to the extreme, and that there's no way to solve this. We just have to come to terms with it. We have to accept it, says the professor. And the way to do that, he says, is to turn to Taoism, which he describes as, quote, the basic way or flow of the world. This will provide, he says, a deeper sense of being, to know that the age-old distinction between divine and human is false. So you get a sense of what Dr. Death, David Owen, what his problem is. He believes he's God. Now, the primary theoretician of Taoism was a man named Chuang Tzu, who lived sometime in the 4th or 3rd century BC. His book, which is beloved by cultists and mystics and British oligarchs today, is an all-out assault on Confucianism, and especially on the Confucian idea of Zhen, this idea of all-pervasive love. He specifically attacks Confucius' call for charity and duty to one's neighbor, which he denounces. He says that charity and duty to one's neighbor is the cause of the destruction of the Tao. He argues that man must not reflect the divine. He writes, quote, there must be a thorough compliance with divine principles, but without any manifestations thereof. All can be summed up in one word, passivity. For the perfect man employs his mind as a mirror. It grasps nothing, it refuses nothing. It receives but does not retain. Also, the mind to Chuang Tzu is incapable of abstract thought and cannot conceive of the infinite. He says, quote, the mind cannot picture to itself a thing without form, nor conceive a form of unlimited dimensions. Now this is pure Aristotle, and I'll come back to this in a moment. Aristotle stated bluntly that the infinite considered as such is unknown. He said that the actual infinite doesn't even exist. In other words, one cannot know God. And in such a world, without Zen and without absolutes, then issues of right and wrong are simply indeterminate. Chuang Tzu argues that, quote, anything is good or evil because it is either good or evil in our eyes. And this is just moral relativism. And under a rule of such moral relativism, he says, quote, there is nothing which is not good and nothing which is not evil. So you can see how this would give rise to tyranny, and in fact it did. Out of this came legalism. To understand legalism, look at Aristotle. To Aristotle, the Platonic and the Confucian notion of man as fundamentally good, capable by nature of contemplating the infinite and hypothecating scientific principles. This was rejected in favor of man born as fundamentally neutral, whose mind is a blind slate, what he called a tabula rasa. To Aristotle, the mind is capable only of recording sense perceptions, of what you can smell and touch and feel and see and so forth. And like a computer, at best can make logical deductions or inductions from the data that's input into the brain. Now, such a human being, of course, has no inherent worth, is not born with any divine qualities, and therefore, in that view, can be shaped at will by those who control his or her education to be anything that they desire, either a functioning bureaucrat who is rewarded with material goods, or a mindless helot who is generally deprived of education, deprived of culture, and condemned to subservient labor, or outright slavery, or as a cog in a machine. Mao Zedong described the perfect communist as he who is a cog in a machine. This is the Taoist mentality of Mao Zedong. Now, this description of Aristotle is also an absolute description of the legalists in China. There was a man named Sun Tzu, who was thought of as the Aristotle of China, who was in opposition to Mencius, argued that man was not born good, but he was born evil. He was not governed by Zhen, by the good that's inscribed in the heart, but by greed and by lust, like any animal. Sun Tzu's students formalized this into a philosophy based on this degraded concept of man, and used this to justify the rule of tyranny, which would be above any laws, any laws of God, any natural law. And this was legalism. It was a Hobbesian nightmare. The preferred ideology under legalism for the masses was Taoism as a way of pacifying them. The legalists came to power in China for a very brief period, a very short reign of 15 years, from 221 to 206 BC. And under this legalist system, under the legalist emperor Qin Shi Huang, who united China through balance of power military operations, Qin banned Confucianism, burned the Confucian texts, and in fact burned several hundred Confucian scholars who had resisted this process. Migrant peasants who were driven off the land, much as today we see hundreds of millions of migrant laborers driven off the land in the People's Republic today. These people were rounded up into slave brigades to build the Great Wall and other projects, where most of them died. Being poor was a crime, much as Milton Friedman's minions today consider poverty to be evidence of laziness. The penalty for the crime of poverty under Emperor Qin Shi Huang was slavery for oneself and for one's entire family. Now, this emperor was the model of Mao Zedong, the idol of Mao Zedong. As I showed in an article last year called The British Role in the Creation of Maoism, these legalists and the Taoist ideology associated with it was embraced as the favorite ideology by the British drug dealers and the British scholars and so forth, in keeping with their bestial social Darwinist view of man, espoused by Hobbes and Hume and Bentham and Smith and the rest of the philosophical prostitutes for the British East Indies Company. The history of the British in China is the history of the sabotage of Confucianism, and especially of any potential for a Christian-Confucian collaboration, such as that was proposed by Dr. Sun Yat-sen, while at the same time they glorified the legalist and the Taoist ideology, including the creation of a worldwide Taoist cult, whose influences are very, very evident today, amongst other places, are extremely evident in the school curricula that are being proposed now by the outcome-based education movement, which we'll be talking a lot about at this conference. Now, look at this population graph. I think what I'll do is just hold it up. It might be easier. Can you? No, that won't be easier. I'm wrong. Upon the death of the legalist emperor Qin, the Qin dynasty was rapidly overthrown. And the Han dynasty, which lasted for 400 years, from 220 AD, was built on a return to Confucianism and established the classics as a standard for education, for scholarship, and for examinations for public office. And you can see that there's sustained growth between 200 BC and 200 AD, a period of sustained growth, which represents the period, this is not working, is it? Yeah. Which represents the period of the dominance of the Confucian ideology. By the time of Christ, the Chinese population was about the same as all of Europe, about 50 million people, and the population density was almost twice that of Europe. Now, what happened to bring down the Han and create the 800-year-long decline that you see on your graph there after the year 200 AD? I don't want to go into any particulars, and just in the most broad generalities. The Han failed to solve the enormous fundamental economic problems that were facing such a vast empire, and a counterculture emerged, with many scholars looking back to Taoism as the Confucian structure of government appeared to be breaking down. It was argued that you could be both a Confucian and a Taoist at the same time, that you would look to Confucius for social and government policy, but that you would look to Taoism for spiritual development. And such an arrangement led to the destruction of Confucianism. It removed the actual spiritual base from Confucianism, the role of Zhen considered as the word of God, and reduced it instead to a formal code of conduct, and thus opened it up to enormous corruption. Very much as you have in the U.S. judicial system now, when you've removed the natural law foundation that all men are created equal with certain inalienable rights. If you remove that, then you're left with a judicial system which can become a vehicle for injustice and for tyranny. And similar things to that happen. During this whole 800-year period of stagnation, up to about the year 1000. Buddhism was introduced into China from India along the Silk Route. And I also don't want to go into any detail on Buddhism here, but I will say that the Mahayana form of Buddhism, which taught the idea of sudden enlightenment through denying reality to the physical universe and basically turning off mentation, stopping thinking altogether, one reaches a sudden enlightenment. Now this belief merged with Taoism, mixed with Taoism, and formed a Chinese form of Buddhism which came known as Chan Buddhism, or in Japanese that's called Zen Buddhism, which is the way we know it in the West. So Zen Buddhism and Taoism and a greatly corrupted form of Confucianism became known as what is called the Three Teachings. And again, one could practice all three, supposedly, just like the Fellowship of Religions meetings that have been going on over these last few weeks. But just like those Fellowship of Religions meetings, if you claim to be trying to bring all religions together by finding the lowest common denominator between them, what you end up with is a bunch of Satanists who are defending human rights of monkeys and such things, as we have today. The amalgam of these three totally incompatible worldviews was to become known as Chinese philosophy. Now, the existence of, quote, Chinese philosophy is itself a racist idea, that somehow being Chinese means that you are limited to a certain philosophical view of the world. Of course, in China, the British teach the Chinese that there is only one thing known as Western philosophy, and to them, what they mean by Western philosophy is British empiricism, of course, Aristotelians. Now, that's not to say that there are not common and unique cultural influences to the Chinese, as distinct from other cultures. But these are ideological questions. Philosophically, one can trace precisely the same philosophical divisions, be you looking at the East or be you looking at the West. In the West, you have on the one hand the Platonists and the Christian Platonists who believe that the world is governed by a single power, which is good and which is intelligible to man due to his creative power of reason. And on the other hand, you have the Aristotelian Gnostic ideology of oligarchs and their minions, who argue that man is basically governed by his animal instincts and can at best submit himself to a pragmatic ordering of a godless society based upon codified punishments and rewards. Now, this same division, precisely, with exactly the same predicates, exists in China, with the Confucianism on one side and the legalists and Taoists on the other. Every swing on this volatile population chart. Now I would like you to zoom in on it. A few moments. Every swing on this chart can be explained by the shifting influence of one or the other of these worldviews over Chinese society. Leaps forward during periods of Confucian dominance, like here and here, and collapses under the influence of Taoist movements that take over the country. The subject of the paper I wrote in the Fidelio this summer is primarily on the great Confucian Renaissance of the 11th and 12th century during the Sung dynasty led by Chu Shi, which generated this enormous leap between 1000 and 1200 in the population of China. The influence of Taoism and Zen during that period virtually collapsed. There was a technological revolution which was generated by the intellectual climate and the method. Among other things, the discovery of paper and printing in China, long before in the West, made China the first nation where the mass production and distribution of books transformed society. Most of these early books were either the classics themselves or Chu Shi and other Neo-Confucian Renaissance leaders' commentaries on the classics, or they were technological books, mostly on agricultural technology, things like seed varieties, hydraulics, irrigation techniques, and so forth, which spread throughout the nation and which created a massive increase in production and which thereby facilitated this enormous population growth. Now, the collapse that you see following this, right after 1200, this is the Mongol invasion. You can just leave it there for a few minutes. This is the Mongol invasion, which the Mongols brought with them not only Taoism, but also, of course, the plague and other horrors. Following the Mongol collapse, it basically collapsed on itself after 100 years or so, came the Ming Dynasty. This next period represents the Ming Dynasty, starting in approximately the late 1300s. And you see, again, an enormous leap. What happened during the early period of the Ming was a basically a complete recovery of the Sung Neo-Confucian Renaissance. The policies of Zhu Xi were adopted entirely. The educational system and the examinations were entirely based on Zhu Xi's doctrines and on the classics. Great projects were launched. The complete rebuilding of the Grand Canal, which connected North and South China, and made it possible to move the capital to Beijing because they were able to move rice up from the south. The launching of some of the greatest voyages of history, enormous armadas of ships, the largest ships in the world, were sent out from China exploring the Indian Ocean, the coasts of Africa, into the Persian Gulf, on voyages of discovery, diplomacy, and scientific research. And again, the population doubled between this period. Now, for reasons that I don't believe are adequately understood in history, in 1435, virtually the same time that in the West, the European Renaissance was being launched by Nicholas of Cusa and his associates at the Council of Florence, the Ming Dynasty abruptly turned inward. It canceled all the voyages and even destroyed many of the ships that had been used in these voyages. The failure of will and vision at that time led to a very rapid deterioration of the Confucian moral structure of society. A new form of the so-called three teachings emerged, which lasts up to today, unfortunately. This happened through the grafting of Zen Buddhism and Taoist ideas into a pseudo-Confucianism by a fellow named Wang Yangming. Again, society degenerated, and the population collapsed between 1600 and 1644, which you see here. And at that time, the Manchu from the north, from Manchuria, were able to sweep down into China and to basically take over the whole country very rapidly, bringing with it a lot of deaths. However, what had happened just before that time, in the late 1500s, right in here, is that the Jesuits had arrived in China. They had arrived and had very rapidly worked themselves into a position where they were given leadership of some of the key ministries, especially astronomy, hydraulics, and other key ministries in the court. And when the Manchu came in, they were quickly convinced that it was best to retain these Jesuits in their positions. And in particular, the child who was destined to become probably the greatest emperor of all of Chinese history, Emperor Kang Xi, who was going to be emperor from 1661 to 1725, that's about 65 years, was given the most extraordinary education you could imagine. He was taught everything from the European Renaissance, the science, the art, the theology, by the Jesuits personally, and at the same time was given a thorough education in the Confucian classics. Kang Xi became a dedicated follower of Zhu Xi, and at the same time a sponsor of Christianity. So it was during this reign that Leibniz carried on his correspondence with the Jesuits, and he launched his plans for a grand design. By that he meant the economic development of the entire Eurasian landmass, linking Europe and China in such a way, as he said, and this is a quote, "As these most cultivated and distant peoples stretch out their arms to each other, those in between may gradually be brought to a better way of life." Now you can see by the graph that the tremendous explosion in population after 1650, right here. Enormous explosion of population. It tripled in a period of 200 years. There was a tripling of the population. This is dramatic proof of the power of the ecumenical alliance between Confucianism and Christianity. The shared belief that man is created in the living image of God. No other Asian nation experienced this population explosion. Japan's population actually declined over the 18th century, while in India the population grew by a mere 10%. And in China, in that 1 century, the population doubled. And in a sense, if you compare that to the world population graph, you can see that China literally joined the population explosion in Europe, which had begun with the Italian Renaissance in the 15th century. The Christian-Confucian alliance, unfortunately, did not last for that 200 years. The same Enlightenment forces that were used by Venice and London to destroy the Renaissance in Europe succeeded in cutting off all Western support for the work that had been done by Leibniz and these missionary scientists in China. And by the time of the death of Kang Xi in 1725, the connection was completely broken, and the potential for Christianization of China was destroyed. Now, this is a very interesting story, but I'm not going to go into that today. Europe on its side, increasingly fell under the British Masonic control. While in China, although the impulse of this Confucian Christian period, the impulse of this lasted, as you can see, throughout the next 200 years. But the cutoff of collaboration, the cutoff of the scientific input from the Golden Renaissance, and the general stagnation that resulted in the Chinese leadership, who tended to return to a Buddhist and Taoist outlook over the next 100 years, left China totally vulnerable to the British gunboats, which arrived in 1840. Now this last dip that you see here, this represents the British arrival in China. In 1840, they began a series of opium wars that lasted through the 1840s and 1850s and into 1860s to force the Chinese to accept the British sale of their Indian-grown opium and massacring the population which refused to accept the drugs. At the same time, they were sponsoring a rebellion in the south of China called the Taiping Rebellion, which claimed to be a pseudo-Christian movement, but in fact was a Taoist atrocity, which was supported by British and American missionaries as well as government officials. Another horror story. Between 1850 and 1950, the Chinese population increased a total of 25%, while the world population was doubling under increasing British control. Okay, you can lift that up. If you can briefly put slide number 4 up on the graph, on the board. This shows a graph of the population under the communists from 1949 up until about 1990. And it shows that the Chinese, under the Taoist leadership of Mao Zedong and company, were totally capable of committing genocide without any outside help. The drastic dip that you see there at the beginning is what was called the Great Leap Forward, where about 30 to 50 million people died. And the decreasing rate of growth, there probably is another dip at around the time of the Cultural Revolution, which doesn't show up in these Chinese communist government figures, but the decreasing rate of growth that you see after the Cultural Revolution, about 1970, is paradigmatic of an impending collapse. Now, at the conference, you can go back to slide 1. Now, I want to go into this Neo-Confucian Renaissance as the last thing I do. I want to review one aspect of what I go through in the article, and that is what I called in there the extension of the thesis by Nicholas of Cusa from his essay on the Peace of the Faith concerning the Christian Trinity. Cusanus posed that the Christian Trinity of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, as revealed through the life of Christ, was also a scientific fact of the universe that was embedded in the laws of the universe long before the appearance of Christ. And that this, therefore, could be discovered by any religion, Christian or any other religion, any religion that believed, or any worldview that believed in a single unifying principle that governs the universe, that's not irrationalist or inconsistent, would discover this triune reality in the process of their investigation of the lawfulness of the creation. And I'll go through what that is in a moment. While Cusanus was not familiar with Confucianism, he showed in that essay that this could be done for virtually any other religion. And what I would like to show is that this is true, emphatically true, with Confucianism as well, following the work of Cusanus and Leibniz. To demonstrate this, let me review the fundamental ideas that were developed by Zhu Xi and his predecessors in the 11th and 12th century, during the Sung dynasty. Zhu Xi wrote an essay called The Treatise on Zhen. He argued that since the death of Mencius, the true meaning of Zhen, and in fact the true meaning of the entire Confucian doctrine, had been generally lost. Zhen had come to mean at best a kind of love which, in a more general sense, encompassing sentimental notions. And in fact, he called it, quote, an inferior and crude concept. Zhu Xi wrote the following, quote, when one realizes that Zhen is the source of love, and that love can never exhaust Zhen, then one has gained a definite comprehension of Zhen. The mind of heaven to produce things is Zhen. The mind of heaven to produce things is Zhen. In man's endowment, he receives this mind from heaven, and thus he can produce. Now you can see that this is very similar to the idea of the Word of God, or the Holy Spirit, which emanates from God and pervades and animates the universe, and is the basis of man's ability to participate in the unfolding creation of that universe. Now this led Zhu Xi to recognize that he had to develop a metaphysical explanation for the relationship between man and the heavens. Neither Confucius nor Mencius had engaged in extensive metaphysical speculation. And this had the unfortunate consequence that Taoist and Zen Buddhist notions of nothingness and longevity and reincarnation and so forth tended to sort of fill the void for the people who were searching for such answers. Jushi addressed this head-on by taking several notions that were used by the Taoists and by the Zen Buddhists and explicating a true metaphysical understanding of these concepts, which was coherent with the concept of Zen discussed above. And in the process carried out a fierce and devastating polemic, and a successful polemic, against both Taoism and Zen Buddhism. The term Tao itself is an example of this. To the Taoists, Jushi exposed that their notion of the Tao was a falsely constructed limit on man's capacity to know anything, as something that lay beyond an unbridgeable gap to man's intelligibility. And he returned instead to the notion of the Tao, which he claimed had been understood by Confucius, which was more like God, the power of love that permeates the universe. And he showed that man can learn more and more and more about the Tao in an unlimited way, bounded only by the absolute infinite of God himself, or of the Tao. This knowledge comes about through man's capacity to contemplate the infinite. And thus we can know the Tao or know God negatively. For example, Jushi says, the Tao alone has no opposite. God is not spatially conditioned. He has neither corporeal form nor body. There is no spot where he can be placed, and so on. All of this not to say that it's beyond our knowledge, but rather that man can only know this through the intellect by conceiving of the negation of these finite limitations which do not apply to God. And by knowing their negative, their negation, you can contemplate and conceptualize the infinite attributes of the Tao. This concept is very similar in nature to the method that was used by St. Thomas Aquinas, nearly a contemporary of Jushi, to refute the materialist finite epistemology of Aristotle in Europe. And it anticipates the work of Nicholas of Cusa 2 centuries later, who developed the idea of negative theology. And you can see this in Will Wirtz's work on Aquinas and on Cusanus. The most important contribution that Jushi made was the idea of li, L-I, the concept of li, which is usually translated as principle. It was a term that was occasionally used by Confucius and Mencius and misused by the Taoists. Jushi defined li as, quote, complete wholeness, above the realm of corporeality, prior to all created things, and so forth. Basically, he meant God, the pure unity, the one, the creator of the universe. But, he says, quote, li is one, but its manifestations are many. There is only one li, but as applied to man, there is in each individual a particular li. And this li, therefore, what he means is that this li is both the one and the many, in the sense that every created thing reflects the lawfulness of the creation. And that this reflection of the Creator is the principle of that created thing. It's the essence of that thing, or its li. And this participates in this universal li, which is God the Creator. Leibniz said about the li, quote, can we not say that the li of the Chinese is the sovereign substance which we revere under the name of God? He saw in the li, in the individual manifestation of the li, as something very similar to his notion of the monad. And in fact, his development of this concept reflected his intense lifelong study of Confucianism and of Jushi in particular. Now this is crucial for scientific method. Unlike the pseudoscience of the Taoists or the Aristotelians or the British empiricists in general, one cannot learn anything truthful or truly useful about the universe simply by observing and recording the accidental attributes of the material form or structure of things. One must be able to hypothesize on the causal relationships between things and events in the universe, on how things change, on how they are changed by other things, and how they, in fact, change other things. When things or events are not understood, or when they contradict existing accepted notions about the universe, then a hypothesis must be formulated and tested through a crucial experiment which challenges existing knowledge with a higher conception. But the clue that's necessary for making such a hypothesis is exactly this understanding of the ordering of the universe. What Leibniz called something called the law of necessary and sufficient reason, which I think can be expressed in Confucian terms adequately as follows, that the principle of any thing or event, its li, is coherent with and participates in God's creation as a whole. And thus it must be perfect, or at least participate in God's perfection, in the sense that it has precisely those qualities which are necessary for it to be and to act as it does, and it has no important extraneous qualities other than those that are sufficient to be and to act as it does. Now, this is precisely what Leibniz meant when he said that God had created the best of all possible worlds. This is the scientific principle. It's similar to the least action principle, which was the basis of Leibniz's discovery of modern science. It's the comprehension of this truth about the physical universe which provides the only possible basis for the kind of thinking necessary for true scientific work. It's the basis upon which hypothesis can be made. Now, it's not surprising, therefore, to find that amongst the empiricist scientists of the 20th century who have been instrumental in destroying the scientific method of hypothesis as it was used by Kepler and Leibniz and Riemann and so forth, we find there are several who are raving Taoists. Not only Joseph Needham, whom I attacked in my article, but also Niels Bohr, who was the founder of quantum mechanics, who it turns out accredits Taoism as the inspiration for all of his life's work. And in fact, his theory of complementarity derived directly from the Taoist yin-yang view of the universe. To such Taoists, no doubt, I suspect, cold fusion is considered neither yin nor yang, and therefore couldn't possibly exist. I promise you more on this in the future. Now, to conclude, we can now look at how this trinity is embedded in nature in Confucianism. Nicholas of Cusa identified the trinity as unity, equality, and connection. What he meant by unity was the one and the many coexisting in the Creator, God, the creator of all things. To Christians, this is God the Father. To the Confucians, this is viewed as the universal Li, the indivisible Li, or the Tao. The second person, the equality, what Cusa meant there was the reflection of the Creator which exists in every created thing and event, which is reflected in the most perfect way in man, in the divine spark of reason. To Christians, Christ represents true equality with God. He is God in that sense. While through the imitation of Christ, all men can share in that equality. To Confucius, this is the individual Li, or the individual principle which exists in all things and events, and which are intelligible to man because he is given the inborn luminous virtue as his Li, his principle, and through which heaven, which has bestowed this on man, makes it possible for him to understand and to comprehend God and the laws of the universe. And finally, the third person, which is the connection, Cusa refers to as love, which emanates from the unity and from all his creations to the extent to which these creations reflect the Creator. This love, which connects all things, is clearly the Christian idea of agape, which is the Holy Spirit, which proceeds from the Father and from the Son. And to Confucius, clearly, this is Zhen, which is the boundless love of heaven and earth. So you have this Trinity in their ideology and in their view of the physical universe. And just as the Trinity in Christianity is an indivisible unity, so in physics this triune nature is an indivisible truth about nature. And so to the Chinese, the Tao, the Li, and the Zhen are an indivisible unity. Now, briefly compare this concept of unity, equality, and connection. Compare this to the Taoist concept of what is called all is one, or the idea that everything is the same, or all is one in God, and their idea of the Tao. Their view is basically the root of virtually every environmental cult today throughout the world. To them, it is not the singular transfinite essence, or Li, of things, which characterize their equality with the Creator and his creations, but it's the material things themselves, the ephemeral, accidental attributes of things. These are all one. There's no distinction between God and man and an animal and a rock. Thus, a spotted owl or a gorilla have the same worth and the same rights as a human being. Now, in such a world, there really is no living God. It's a world in which things are self-moving with no higher governing principle, plodding through time with no guidance, which is basically reduced to a mindless, bestial world of the vastly discredited Darwinian foolishness, the rule of greed and lust. Now, can China turn away from its current course, which is heading for yet another catastrophic collapse of the population, and instead contribute to a new renaissance for all mankind? Confucius and Mencius and Zhu Xi live very much in the hearts of the Chinese people. Although Mao Zedong forcefully eliminated all teachings of the classics, and in fact he burned the books and murdered the scholars just as his mentor Qin Shi Huang had done 2,000 years earlier. But still, the tradition is passed on, however imperfectly, usually from father to son, from parent to child or grandparent to child. In fact, most of the Chinese who were in attendance at this conference today, I would suspect, learned a great deal of this from their parents or from their grandparents, despite the attempt to crush it by Maoist education policies. The tradition is somewhat preserved in Taiwan, but it's endangered there, much as in the West, there are very few who are not compromised with Taoist ideology, with the Taoist Aristotelian ideology. And therefore, our own role in renewing the ecumenical method and the grand design of Leibniz is absolutely indispensable. And the time is very short. So, that's it. I thank you. It's been my pleasure to be here with you, certainly in image and certainly in spirit. Locates a culture at that time with an extremely advanced capacity to carry out scientific investigations of the heavens. Another reference to a specific constellation has been almost certainly traced back to the 16th millennium, 16,000 years before Christ, which indicates it gives you a sense of the scope of Chinese historical and scientific research. And in fact, it can be shown that every culture up until that time, every ruling group, had based their authority upon their astronomical studies and their development of solar calendars. Now, LaRouche has emphasized repeatedly that the beginning of the recognition of man as being in the image of God in early civilizations can be and must be traced to the study of the lawfulness of the circular action within the heavens. What I'd like to do is to show you a couple of examples from Confucius classics. And if you put up slide 2, you don't have to do anything, but at the conference, please put up slide 2. In the Analects, which is the collection of Confucius' own teachings, the master is asked by some of his disciples, "What will we do when you die? Where will we turn for guidance when you die?" And his response to that is, look to the heavens. What do they say? Do the seasons not run their appointed course, and all things proceed according to their nature? Look to the heavens. What do they say? Put up slide 3. In the poetry classic, or the book of poetry, the following poem is contained, which is quoted both by Confucius and by Mencius, which is on the intelligibility of the creation and on the source of human virtue being located in the quest for mastering that lawfulness. Heaven, in creating mankind, created all things according to law, such that people can grasp this law and will love virtue. Now, Confucius identified a concept which is called in China propitiate the Chinese, which is what the Jesuits are virtually always accused of, to attempt to win favor with the Chinese by accepting their ideas. This was not the point. The point was to scientifically discover the cause in the ideas of the development of Chinese civilization, which they discovered, what they found there. And the only place you could look for such a cause is precisely in the coherence of their ideas with the fundamental laws of the universe, the scientific laws of the universe. The problem in China today is not overpopulation. It's that this nation has been subjected to 150 years of British opium, British imperial looting, foreign wars, civil wars, and then 44 years of Maoist lunacy. And the result of this, over the long term, is the general breakdown of the infrastructure in that nation, both the physical infrastructure and the human infrastructure, especially in regard to education. And as a result, this renders the existing economy generally incapable of sustaining this very large population. Now, the IMF and Deng Xiaoping's reformers plan to solve this problem through a process of mass forced abortion, and through a process of generally grinding up what they call the surplus labor, the blind flow of labor, the now almost 200 million unemployed Chinese peasants who are being ground up in free trade zones for cheap labor. We're looking at a potential for another Holocaust in China, caused by precisely the same forces who have caused repeated Holocausts throughout Chinese history. Now, please turn to slide 1, and if I can ask you to gear in on this. I'll just point at this one. I'd like you to come in on it. This is a chart, which you'll be able to see there at the conference, and I'll show on tape, of the population between about 400 BC in China through about 1950. I'm very, very glad to be able to make this presentation to you today via this videotape, and I wish to thank the various people here at Nottoway from the Film and Media Group who made this possible. And I hope I'll be able to be there in person soon. The topic of the presentation is the correlation between the ideas of men and nature and the success or failure of building civilizations, with a focus on China, which is the general theme of the conference. In general, it's well known that the oligarchical institutions attempt to justify their genocidal policies by blaming starvation, wars, disease, and so forth on overpopulation. This is a common policy. And in that, they maintain a very special place for China and India, primarily because that constitutes about 2/5 of the world's population. They argue that it is impossible for China and other nations of that sort to develop unless they drastically reduce their populations. In fact, they go beyond that and argue that these nations must not develop precisely because of the size of their populations. In the recent pop bestseller, Preparing for the 21st Century, written by Yale guru Paul Kennedy, he argues that China and India must be kept in a state of low energy use and primitive existence. He says, quote, "Development would bring appalling consequences for their environment and would threaten the Earth's overall atmosphere. China's industrial ambitions," he says, "pose a threat to the planet." Development is a threat to the planet, according to this fellow. And such evil is unfortunately not new in this century. It's been the policy of those like Arnold Toynbee and Bertrand Russell and others throughout the 20th century. But we must look at China the way that Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz did, together with his Jesuit associates that he was in correspondence with, who were missionaries in China back in the late 17th and early 18th century. These Jesuits who, beginning with the extraordinary Matteo Ricci, who reached China in the late 16th century, came armed with the fruits of the Golden Renaissance, with maps, astronomical instruments, musical instruments, paintings that used the Renaissance perspective that had been developed in Florence, and so forth. And what they found in China was not a primitive, backwards culture, but an extremely advanced culture, one which was already not only developed in science and technology, but in many areas were far in advance of European culture, and certainly pre-Renaissance culture in various areas of science and technology. And in fact, also was an extremely learned population that was very much open to the new ideas that were coming out of the Golden Renaissance. They also found 160 million people. And this was, at that time, about 1/4 of the world's population, with a density of about 40 people per square kilometer, which was nearly twice that of Europe at the time. They had a generally higher, or at least equivalent standard of living, and a generally higher rate of literacy. Now, to Leibniz, this proved something. It proved that this society had mastered, to a significant degree, the fundamental laws of nature. That it was proof, basically, that they knew God, in the sense that, to the degree that they were able to sustain the continuing, unfolding creation. And Leibniz studied the Confucian classics with exactly this in mind. He was studying the translations that had been provided to him by the Jesuits, and he approached it based on the assumption that the fundamental understanding of man as having been created in the image of God, imago viva Dei, must be embedded in their philosophical writings, as proven by their advanced culture and by their high population. Now, the purpose of this was not to gratuitously gloss over shortcomings and errors within Confucian philosophy, it was not, you can't see the numbers very well here, I hope you can better at the conference, but this starts at 400 BC, and then you can see the general shape of this, and you can see that it's a very volatile chart as well. And at the conference you should have above that a chart of world population, and I want you to note that that world chart is not on the same scale, so it's going to be, don't try to judge point for point, but rather I want you to see the different shapes of these curves. Okay. Now, let me see. I guess I should ask you to come back onto me here. Yeah. Come back. I think what I'm going to do is lift this up when I get to it. That might be easier. Okay, now, to reverse this process of collapse, we must first ask what caused this population to grow in the first place. And to do that, we have to look at Confucius. Now, Confucius died in 479 BC. What he did during his lifetime, among other things, is that he compiled what are called the 5 classics, which they're a compilation of the oral and written tradition of Chinese antiquity, together with his own contributions. To Confucius, the Golden Age, which he writes about, was actually far before his own time. It spans an era from approximately 2500 BC through about 1000 BC. And in fact, there can be no doubt about the existence of advanced civilizations, despite various people who attempt to say that this is a mythical age or that Confucius made this up for his own purposes. But there's no doubt about the existence of these advanced civilizations, because the evidence for this, astronomical evidence, exists within the classics themselves. 19th century European scholars and astronomers, whom we are now looking into today, used passages from these 5 classics, in particular from the Book of History, or the History Classic, which specify in one case, the meridian passages of a series of stars at the summer solstice. And using the precession of the equinox, it's possible now to prove that these measurements must have taken place precisely in the year 2357 BC, which